Callel perched on the knoll, the twin suns of Bala Roman 4 dipping below the horizon in a blaze of orange and violet. Beside her, Astra sighed, her human eyes not on the sky, but fixed on the glittering expanse beyond. "I want to go there," Astra declared, her voice a mix of longing and the fierce certainty that always made Callel slightly uneasy. "Not just visit, Callel. Build something that can take us to those stars." Callel shivered, not from cold, but from the audacity of the dream. Her people excelled at careful calculations, at charting steady courses. Astra, like all humans, seemed to hunger for the horizon itself. "Don't you ever?" Callel began, then faltered. Astra tilted her head, that unsettlingly direct human gaze pinning her in place. Callel, skilled in the intricate diplomacy of a dozen races, suddenly felt like an uncertain child. "Don't I ever what?" Astra prodded, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Worry about how big it all is," Callel finished lamely. Astra laughed, a clear, full sound that echoed oddly against the stillness of the alien world. "Worry? No. Fear gets in the way of getting things done. Now, about that starship." Years warped past in a blur of diplomatic exchanges and tense negotiations. Callel rose through the ranks of her people, her measured words and cautious analyses a known quantity amongst the shifting alliances of the Tri-Sector League. Now, though, an undercurrent of unease rippled through the Grand Chamber, a stark contrast to the usual choreographed posturing. She caught Astra's eye across the room. The human, as always, was the center of attention, surrounded by a cluster of delegates from various species, her laughter ringing out. Yet there was a tightness around Astra's jaw, a subtle shift in her posture, that echoed Callel's own disquiet. Something was wrong. This wasn't about petty trade disputes or border squabbles, not with this many high-level envoys gathered. Then Ambassador Tarvel, his voice usually a smooth current, stuttered over the translator feed. "Unconfirmed reports. Human outpost. On the rim." The chamber erupted. Whispers turned into panicked murmurs. The rim, a volatile, resource-rich zone tangled in ancient treaties and fueled by simmering rivalries. Humans, relentless in their expansion, seemed to have finally crossed a line. Astra's laughter cut off abruptly. Callel's antennae twitched nervously as she watched the human delegation. Not fear, not exactly the glint in their eyes was cold, calculating. A wave of unease swept over Callel. She remembered stargazing on Bala Roman 4, a flicker of childhood memory. Humans were not merely explorers, they were conquerors. Fueled by a hunger for the unknown, they thrived on the thrill of pushing boundaries, bending uncharted territories to their will. News of the border incident traveled with the speed of fear. When the emergency summit was called, Callel was unsurprised to find herself summoned. The atmosphere in the war room wasn't one of panic, but something worse. A grim pragmatism honed over centuries of galactic conflict. Her own people, the architects of cautious strategy, proposed familiar solutions reinforcing nearby outposts, dispatching envoys to open a hesitant dialogue. Then the humans took the floor. Ambassador Reyes, sharp-eyed and unnervingly composed, outlined a plan that bordered on insanity. It wasn't about seeking peace, but a bewildering gambit of deception and calculated risk. Untested shielding technology, maneuvers designed to mimic weakness, targeted strikes aimed not at destroying, but at dismantling the enemy's will to fight. "You want us to bait them?" Callel couldn't keep the disbelief out of her voice. It was suicide, a reckless gamble at a time when cool heads were needed. Reyes didn't rise to the challenge. Instead, he simply smiled, a thin, mirthless twist of his lips. History is full of battles won not by the biggest fleet, Envoy Callel, but by those willing to risk everything on the most audacious gamble. His gaze turned to the star map, tracing ancient Earth conflicts wars Callel had dismissed as the archaic struggles of a young species. Yet in that moment she saw not chaos, but a strange pattern emerging. Humans, throughout their tumultuous history, had a chilling tendency to turn desperation into devastating, unexpected victories. Were they mad? Perhaps. But in a galaxy that valued order above all else, a bit of well-timed madness might just be the only answer. The arguments raged on long into the night. Callel sat on the sidelines, the discordant symphony of alien voices mirroring the chaos in her own mind. Every fiber of her being screamed at her that the human plan was a catastrophic mistake. The simulations were clear. It was a coin toss with annihilation on one side. Yet, a strange fascination held her captive. Reyes was relentless, countering every objection with a maddeningly calm logic, citing obscure historical references and psychological strategies no other species would dare consider. Half the chamber was disgusted, the other half intrigued. This fascination gnawed at Callow. It mirrored an internal division within her own people, the ever-present conflict between staid traditionalists and a growing faction of progressives who yearned for something bolder. Was this what had drawn her to Astra years ago, that restless human spirit? Her superiors sent a silent command, a subliminal pulse through the translator implants that left no room for ambiguity. Withdraw support, distance themselves from the human recklessness. A wise move politically, it preserved her species' reputation for reasoned judgment. But as her antennae twitched in preparation to transmit the official declaration, she hesitated. Images flashed in her mind. Astra gazing at the stars, Reyes' chillingly confident smile, battlefields from human history where impossible odds had somehow been overcome. In that moment, Callow made a choice. Ignoring protocol, she switched to a frequency used for unofficial backchannels. Envoy Callow to coalition forces. Holding position. Do not interpret this as an endorsement of the human strategy, she added pointedly, but her pulse quickened. She'd gambled everything not just on the humans, but on the belief that the galaxy might just be stagnant enough to need a dose of calculated madness. The plan unfolded in chaotic bursts, as unpredictable as the humans themselves. The first phase, the bluff, almost fell apart immediately. The prototype shield, known to be unstable, flickered under the initial onslaught. Shouts of human panic were broadcast, a calculated move, laced with an earworm of an ancient Earth pop song so infectiously upbeat, it was almost physically painful to Callow's sensitive hearing. Madness. But the enemy hesitated. The shield held just barely. As predicted, they focused their attack on its known weak point. Now the humans did the unthinkable. They diverted power, exposing another flank in what could only be interpreted as suicidal incompetence. Except it wasn't. Callow's translator implant crackled with activity she didn't dare fully analyze. Human warships were slipping undetected through seemingly random jump points, emerging behind enemy lines with a ruthlessness that made her shiver. Yet no killing blows were ordered, instead, a series of precision strikes targeting enemy communications arrays. Across the coalition network, an argument played out in real time, mirroring the one from days ago. Traditionalists screamed for Callow's head, furious at her insubordination. But a thread of chaotic energy rippled through the channels. Members of her own species, swayed by the maddening rhythm of the human gambit, whispering of long stalemate conflicts broken by similar displays of audacious brilliance. Suddenly, a breakthrough. Intercepted signals from the enemy revealed internal mutiny. Inspired by the humans' defiance of every rule of war, a dissident faction, long suppressed, had seized the moment of weakness. What had been a unified front descended into bewildered disarray. It was then the humans did the most unexpected thing. They offered a ceasefire. They won. Not a glorious, crushing victory, but a precarious win nonetheless. The fighting stopped, borders were redrawn with tense negotiations, and an unsteady truce settled over the rim. Callow, to her astonishment, found herself in the spotlight. Her gamble, her refusal to abandon the humans, made her a divisive figure, a traitor to some, a visionary to others. The humans were no less polarizing. Ambassador Reyes and his team were hailed as military geniuses. Delegations from nervous systems sought them out, eager to learn, yet also deeply unsettled. There was a wary respect in the way other species now spoke of humanity, fear mingling with an uncomfortable awareness that the old rules no longer applied. Reyes himself was an enigma. The haunted look in his eyes told Callow that their victory had come at a cost he was unwilling to share. During a private debriefing, he spoke not of glory, but of sacrifice. He showed her the casualty reports higher than the official numbers, a toll borne from the humans having to push themselves as brutally as their enemy. Was it worth it? She asked, her voice small. Reyes smiled wearily. Madness and reason, envoy, he said, his voice an echo of that long-ago night on Balaroman 4. They walk a fine line, don't they? Word of her newfound influence rippled through the League. It presented an opportunity Calo could never have imagined. She became a leading voice in a movement of burgeoning progressives across multiple systems. Inspired by the audacity of the humans and her own gamble, they proposed new alliances, bolder exploration initiatives, and a shift away from the stifling stasis that had held back the galaxy for too long. The future was uncertain, the path forward paved with both promise and peril. Yet, as Calo stood on a balcony overlooking the sprawling League headquarters, she felt an unfamiliar emotion, hope. Perhaps it was as contagious as that strange human music that still seemed to echo in her head. Or maybe, just maybe, a touch of well-placed madness was exactly what this galaxy needed. Years had passed, blurring into a whirlwind of treaties, summits, and fiery speeches. Calo, no longer just an envoy, but a revered, if controversial leader, found herself on a diplomatic shuttle headed for a neutral moon. Her destination wasn't on any official star chart. The shuttle shuddered to a halt on dusty red rock. Outside, an aging figure awaited, leaning on a simple carved staff. It took her a moment to recognize the ambassador Reyes she'd last seen surrounded by adulation, his eyes haunted. Now, stripped of titles and the sharp cut of his uniform, he seemed both smaller and paradoxically larger. "I hear you've shaken the foundations of the League," he stated, the barest hint of his old sardonic humor edging his voice. "And nearly brought it crashing down," Calo retorted, but there was no real heat in her words. They walked along the crater's rim, the vastness of space a stark backdrop to their conversation. Reyes spoke of battles won and lost within the tangle of galactic politics, the human colonies thriving in the rim, the new generation of commanders who studied his gamble with disquieting intensity. "They admire you," Calo murmured, perhaps a bit too much. "That madness of ours. It's a potent weapon," Reyes admitted. His gaze drifted to the stars. But the galaxy wasn't ready, not for how much it might cost. Silence settled between them. Calo, in this moment of silence, realized they were both outcasts now. Her, for embracing the human gamble, him, for the toll the victory had taken on his soul. Was it worth it? She asked again, echoing her question from that long-ago debriefing. Reyes turned to her, a flicker of vulnerability in his aged eyes. "Worth is a dangerous question, Calo. Was it worth touching those stars you dreamed of?" He gestured upwards. "Some prices can't be calculated until long after they're paid." They stood together, two figures dwarfed by the cosmic expanse, bound by a shared choice and its lingering consequences. The future they had helped shape shimmered before them, still unwritten, poised forever on the razor's edge between glorious possibility and catastrophic ruin. The training sim was unforgiving. Ensign Liara lithe, antennae twitching with anxious energy, braced for the onslaught. This wasn't a standard League battle scenario, but a chillingly accurate recreation of the pivotal conflict on the rim, the one her people called the madness. The humans erupted onto the screen in a baffling, unpredictable wave. Explosions bloomed like grotesque flowers, and just when strategic withdrawal seemed logical, they executed a maneuver that made no sense on any tactical chart. It was as if reason itself had been thrown out the airlock. "Observe your ancestors' audacity," the instructor barked, a hint of disgust in his usually neutral voice. Liara suppressed a shudder. Her people prided themselves on careful planning, on victory achieved through meticulous strategy. Yet she couldn't deny the chilling effectiveness of the human gamble. The sim ended in a stalemate, the cost of the victory made sickeningly clear. Later, unable to shake the unease, she sought out the forbidden texts, not dry League histories, but the humans' own records. Songs of defiance, clips from ancient Earth wars, even crudely drawn comics depicting human soldiers laughing in the face of impossible odds. It was disorienting, disturbing, and deep down, Liara felt a terrifying thrill too. Every lesson hammered into her echoed the stern mantra, "This is how wars are won." But those simulations now seemed stale, predictable. Was this the spark that ignited the reforms her elders spoke of with cautious optimism? A spark they couldn't fully comprehend? Sleep was elusive. Staring at the unfamiliar ceiling patterns of her barrack, she imagined Calo, the enigmatic leader who dared to stand by the humans, and that haunted figure Ray's. They had gambled everything on the belief that the galaxy was stagnant, trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle of cautious conflict. Were they right? The League was changing, alliances shifting. There was excitement in the Academy, a hunger for a bolder approach that sent shivers down her carapace. Yet doubt lingered too. Was this the precipice of glorious expansion, or the first step on a descent into endless war fueled by the seductive delusion of inevitable victory? The barracks buzzed with nervous energy. Samira, fresh out of boot camp and sporting the emblem of the Terran Armed Forces, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Aliens, once figures seen on bland educational vids, now shared the mess hall, their multifaceted eyes observing humans with a mix of apprehension and fascination. It felt unreal. "Bet they still think we're crazy," her bunkmate, Torres, muttered, echoing her own thoughts. Crazy, maybe. Legends, definitely. The Rim conflict hung heavy in the air, studied in every military academy in the known galaxy. Samira wasn't even born when Reyes orchestrated that insane gamble, yet the echoes of it had shaped her training. Earth tactics were now dissected alongside traditional League doctrine, calculated audacity, weaponized unpredictability, the thin line between genius and catastrophic miscalculation. It made her both proud and uneasy. The instructors, veterans from all corners of the galaxy, carried themselves differently now. There was respect for the uniform she wore, a wariness she couldn't quite decipher. Some admired the humans, eager to learn, some seemed almost resentful, as if a sacred balance had been upended. Later, in the VR simulator, the shift hit home. She wasn't fighting faceless enemies, but League troop species she'd seen only as allies. It made the mock battles unsettlingly real. The tactics she'd honed to relentless perfection suddenly felt less certain. What if the enemy was now emboldened to match the famed human madness? "You hesitate." The instructor's voice, usually booming, was subdued. An alien, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, studied the sim replay. Reyes would not have done so. He played to win, regardless of the cost. And there it was, the legacy she couldn't escape. Reyes, the architect of a victory that blurred the lines between hero and harbinger. His name was chanted in parades with awe, whispered in strategy rooms with disquiet. Did the galaxy see them all that way now? Weapons barely contained, their unpredictability their most dangerous asset. That night, under the unfamiliar glow of an alien moon, Samira wondered about the future she'd signed up for. It was bigger, wilder than anything she'd imagined as a stargazing kid on Earth. Yet, instead of simple excitement, a knot of unease tightened in her gut. Perhaps true humanity wasn't in their boldness, but in the struggle to balance boldness with the wisdom to know when not to embrace the madness. Lieutenant Samira Chen, not even a decade out of the academy, found herself in command of a small patrol ship on the edge of League space. Routine mission: deter pirates, chart new hyperspace lanes, all the standard tedium that was the bread and butter of keeping the peace. At least, that's what it had been. The first sign that things weren't standard was the crew. Half were human, the other half League veterans of at least 3 species. The tension thrummed beneath the surface courtesy, fueled by a shared history none of them had personally lived through. Then came the distress call. A lone surveyor vessel caught on the wrong side of a shifting border zone, surrounded by scavengers who'd grown bold enough to harass League ships. Ordinarily, this would have been a simple scare and rescue op, but the surveyor held a crew of predominantly young recruits from Kal''s progressive coalition, eager to prove themselves. Textbook hostage situation, her comms officer, a veteran with scales shimmering in irritated hues, muttered as she relayed the enemy demands. Samira surveyed the tactical display, a classic encirclement. The old her, the academy trained her, would have executed a precision maneuver, calculated and methodical. But the human doctrine whispered in her head. Shock and awe, break the pattern, force them to question their assumptions. Her order, when it came, wasn't what the crew expected. They hit the scavengers hard, but with seemingly erratic maneuvers, bursts of comms chatter laced with dissonant music and ancient war cries. It was a gamble designed to make them look unhinged, reckless. Exactly what pirates had come to fear from humans since the madness. It worked, sort of. The scavengers scattered, confused. But in the chaos, a shot clipped the surveyor vessel. Not a fatal hit, but panic erupted across the comms channels. Those weren't battle-hardened cadets, but the sons and daughters of leaders who believed in the new, bolder league, a league humans had helped shape. The tactical display blinked a chilling statistic: rescue maneuvers would expose her own ship to unacceptable risk. It echoed what Reyes had taught the galaxy: human victories came at a price. Samira hesitated, a moment stretching into an eternity. Then, in a move that would either be court-martialed or hailed as tactical genius, she ordered comms to blare a single ancient Earth rock anthem, a song of defiance against impossible odds. Her ship lurched forward, a reckless charge no sane commander would attempt. It was madness, glorious and terrible, and it might, just might, buy those scared kids on the other ship enough time, and enough belief in the audacity of their allies to get themselves out of the mess. The battle, if you could call it that, was over before it truly began. Whether it was the shock of the humans' unhinged tactics or plain old incompetence, the scavenger fleet disintegrated into a panicked scramble. The damaged surveyor limped to safety, its shaken crew wide-eyed and unsure whether to hail their rescuers as brilliant or suicidal. Samira sat in the command chair, the adrenaline rush giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. Applause echoed through the comms. The alien half of her crew, initially wary, seemed ignited by the thrill of it, by the old stories made real. Even her scaled comms officer offered a gruff, "Not bad for a human." But the praise felt hollow. She had gambled with lives not just her own, but those idealistic young recruits. Relief washed over her, yes, but also the lingering sting of doubt. Reyes had won a war this way. Had she just started another one? Word traveled faster than her battered patrol ship. By the time they reached the nearest League outpost, Samira was summoned for debriefing. A mixed council awaited stern traditionalists, eager to condemn her recklessness, and the new guard, callow supporters, with an unsettling glint in their many eyes. The inquiry dragged on. Every decision she'd made was mercilessly dissected. Was the musical blast a stroke of psychological genius or an act of unforgivable arrogance, fueling dangerous stereotypes about humans? Had her gambit saved the surveyor crew, or would it embolden similar attacks, forcing the League to match human unpredictability with an escalation they could ill afford? No clear verdict was reached, leaving Samira in limbo. Technically cleared, she was also unofficially under observation. Celebrated in hushed tones by some, she felt scrutinized by others. Her crew became minor celebrities, a reminder of the human-shaped shift in the galactic order. Back on Earth, tucked away in her parents' quiet apartment, Samira found no solace. The news feeds were ablaze with her reckless maneuver. Analysts debated whether she was the future of the Terran armed forces or its greatest liability. She saw her own uncertainty mirrored in her parents' eyes, pride tinged with a fear she couldn't assuage. Had the galaxy unleashed a monster by embracing the human madness? Or was this jolt what it needed to avoid stagnation, to face unknown threats with the courage to rewrite the rules? Looking back on her actions, Samira wasn't sure of the answer herself. All she knew was that the future felt both unbearably heavy and dizzyingly open, and her place in it was as precarious as it was pivotal. Time warped and blurred. Samira's name faded from the headlines, yet the tremors of her actions lingered. League battle doctrines subtly changed, prioritizing flexibility, even a touch of daring. There was talk of exchange programs, joint maneuvers, perhaps even a unified force built on the uneasy marriage of human audacity and the methodical strategies of other species. Yet whispered warnings echoed in the corridors of power. Could this unity last, or was the galaxy hurtling towards a greater, far more devastating conflict fueled by this newfound boldness? Samira herself became a symbol, her face plastered on recruitment posters, even as high command debated her future. She found herself teaching, passing on not just tactics, but the heavy burden of choice. Her classrooms were filled with bright-eyed cadets of a dozen species, all hungry for the edge, the madness that had become synonymous with victory. One evening, she found a familiar face among the trainees, Liara, the anxious recruit haunted by the old Sims. Now there was a steely resolve in the tilt of her antennae, a mirroring of Samira's own lingering self-doubt. It was humbling, and a little terrifying to see the legend she'd become reflected in the eyes of the next generation. Kal-El, no longer just a leader, but a revered elder stateswoman, sought Samira out. They met on a distant space station, its vast windows framing the ceaseless bustle of ships, a testament to the thriving yet restless galaxy they had wrought. "You were right," Kal-El said, her voice etched with a weariness Samira now understood in her bones. Reyes was right. Audacity has its place, but it's a weapon that cuts both ways. There were no easy answers, no triumphant speeches about the future. Just two figures, human and alien, bound by choices that had reshaped the stars around them. It was an ending of sorts, but also a beginning uncertain, brimming with a strange, shared hope that the next generation, the Liaras and the bright-eyed recruits, might find a wiser path. The galaxy, like those who shaped it, was poised forever on the knife's edge, caught in the breathtaking, terrible tension between the madness that pushed boundaries and the reason that determined just how far they could bend before breaking. Instructor Liara suppressed a shudder. The cadet in the simulator was brilliant, audacious, and utterly reckless. He executed a maneuver that made her antennae twitch in alarmed disbelief, a near-suicidal gamble that paid off only through sheer dumb luck. Yet the class erupted in cheers, their multifaceted eyes sparkling with admiration. "That," the cadet preened, a brash young human named Jensen, "is how you win wars." Liara felt a flash of anger mixed with a disquieting sense of recognition. Weren't those the same cheers she'd heard for Lieutenant Chen years ago? Now it was Chen's legend that fueled this hunger for risk. These cadets weren't just learning tactics, but embracing a seductive myth of invincibility, the myth she had helped create. Her report on the sim session was blunt, bordering on insubordination. She braced for reprimand, perhaps even reassignment. Instead, a summons came from an unexpected source. Fleet Admiral Reyes, the architect of the madness himself, now a spectral figure, whispered about in reverent tones. His quarters were disconcertingly Spartan, a stark contrast to the sleek efficiency of the flagship. Reyes, aged further than the vids implied, fixed her with eyes that still held the uncanny spark that had both terrified and inspired her in those forbidden texts. "They frighten you," he observed, his voice a rasp devoid of accusation. "They don't understand the cost, sir," Liara retorted, her voice catching. "They see the victories, not the," she gestured helplessly, the weight of history too heavy for words. Reyes offered a thin smile. "And you believe Lieutenant Chen, Captain Chen now, isn't she? You believe she regrets her choice?" That was the question Liara wrestled with late into the night, unable to reconcile the celebrated hero, the woman she'd looked up to, with a gamble that could have so easily ended in disaster. The galaxy they'd built was dynamic, yes, but it crackled with a tension that threatened to ignite into something far more dangerous than the stagnation of the past. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the flagship's life support. Liara, every instinct screaming at her to stand at attention, forced herself to meet Rey's gaze. "Regret is a complicated thing, instructor," he said finally, leaning forward with an unnerving intensity. "It lives alongside pride, necessity, and the uncomfortable knowledge that sometimes terrible sacrifices are the only path forward." His words echoed her own sleepless nights of self-examination. "But our cadets," she began hesitantly, "they see only the glory. They are being taught that madness is the key to victory. What happens when that madness isn't guided by the wisdom to see beyond the next battle?" Reyes sighed, the weight of countless campaigns settling upon his aged shoulders. "You think I didn't teach wisdom alongside the audacity? That Kal-El, and I didn't see the dangers?" He shook his head. "The galaxy wasn't ready to listen then. Maybe it still isn't." A wave of guilt washed over her. Reyes and Kal-El had paved the way for those like her, those who dared to dream beyond stagnant traditions, and now she questioned the very foundation of this bolder, brighter future. "I hear echoes, sir," Liara continued, finding her voice. "Old League races, ones slow to accept change, are accelerating their military programs. It feels like the build-up before." She couldn't bring herself to say the word war, not in the presence of this man who had orchestrated the most infamous conflict in recent history. "Perhaps," Reyes conceded, "or perhaps a necessary evolution. We cannot force peace through stagnation, Liara. Readiness, that has always been the key. But what kind of readiness? Liara wanted to scream. Readiness for an inevitable repeat of history, for humanity's hard-won influence to unravel into reckless conflict fueled by the very legend Reyes himself had created. Frustration edging her voice, she asked the question burning within her. And what of Captain Chen? Does she believe it was worth it? The flicker of pain behind Rey's eyes was his only answer. The walk back to her quarters blurred into a series of disjointed images. Neon signs advertising alien pubs, establishments catering to the wave of young officers eager to taste the freedom and danger of the galactic frontier. A hushed argument between cadets about the morality of Rey's infamous gambit. The persistent, unsettling chirp of fleet-wide news updates filled with whispers of escalating border skirmishes. Each fragment seemed to tear at a different piece of Liara's carefully maintained composure. How could she reconcile her growing doubts with her duty to train the next generation, a generation hungrily embracing the lessons of boldness Reyes had set into motion? Her sanctuary offered no solace. Datapads blinked with lesson plans waiting to be finalized, training regimens to be approved. It was her skill, her meticulous analysis that had brought her this coveted position, training the best and the brightest. Yet each outlined maneuver, each simulated battlefield felt like a lie promoting a dangerous illusion of control in a galaxy teetering towards a chaos of its own making. Worse was the memory of Chen on the precipice of her fateful decision. Liara saw a younger version of herself in that hesitation, torn between duty and an instinctual recoil from the precipice. But then the anthem, the reckless charge, and victory snatched from the jaws of disaster. Was this the only path now? Sleep was a restless battle against visions of burning ships and battlefields, echoing with the insane laughter of Jensen, drunk on the potential of his own destructive brilliance. When dawn broke, she wasn't rested, but hardened with a cold resolve. The academy buzzed with its usual energy, but Liara saw it with new eyes. In the cocky swagger of the cadets, in the sleek lines of warships being prepped for extended patrols, there was an undercurrent of anticipation. Here, within these pristine corridors, fueled by legends and simulations, was the crucible where war was forged, one reckless gamble at a time. It was time to stop merely observing, to act. The change didn't happen overnight. Liara didn't march into her superior's office and launch into an impassioned plea to dismantle the system she was a part of. That would be reckless without being truly audacious, the kind of blunder a too eager cadet would make. Instead, she became a master of subtle alterations. Lesson plans subtly shifted. Simulations now included not only how to exploit an enemy's weakness, but also how such a gamble could turn against them. Historical briefings focused as much on the brutal aftermaths of glorious victories as the victories themselves. And woven between tactical maneuvers, she slipped in case studies focused on the psychological toll of warfare, highlighting the hauntingly empty gazes in official portraits of figures like Reyes and Chen. It was a dangerous game. Her superiors, accustomed to her by the book analysis, were initially pleased by this newfound focus on holistic readiness. Liara was, after all, ensuring her recruits were prepared for anything. Yet, under the surface, she was planting seeds of doubt, forcing them to question the seductive narrative of inevitable triumph. The students were, predictably, split. Some, like Jensen, accused her of cowardice, of trying to stifle their potential. Others, though, the ones who carried a flicker of the same hesitation she'd once felt, seemed to grasp the hidden thread of her lessons. Arguments broke out in the mess hall, not just about tactics, but about the morality of the choices they'd be forced to make. It was messy, unsettling, and far more effective than any direct confrontation could ever be. News of this unrest, carefully orchestrated through seemingly innocuous reports, began to filter upwards. Liara knew she was taking a risk pushing too far could brand her a troublemaker, derailing her career. But she also knew that inaction carried its own price tag, one measured in lives that might be lost to preventable conflict. One evening the summons came, this time not from Reyes, but a high-ranking League official, his iridescent scales shifting uneasily under the harsh lights of his office. Liara braced herself for reprimand, for the hard end to her quiet rebellion. Instead, he offered an opportunity. A special project, revamping outdated League readiness protocols and incorporating stressors unique to the current strategic landscape. It was a vague phrasing, open to interpretation, a test to see how far her quiet campaign had truly reached. Liara accepted the special project with a composure that masked her inner turmoil. It was a lifeline, unexpected validation that her quiet rebellion was noticed by those who mattered. Here was a chance not merely to disrupt from the inside, but to reshape the system. The work consumed her. She buried herself in archaic League protocols, unearthing a tangle of outdated assumptions and a startling lack of preparedness for the chaotic nature of conflicts in the post-Ray's galaxy. Her proposals were meticulous, subtly audacious scenarios echoing the madness she'd come to dread, woven with contingencies designed to emphasize the cost, not the thrill, of high-risk gambles. It felt like laying a minefield, each provision a testament to a future she desperately hoped to avoid. Word of her project spread. Some saw it as long overdue reform. Others whispered of a new kind of indoctrination, a paranoia mirroring the very instability she aimed to counter. And Jensen, his swagger dimmed after too many bruisingly realistic simulations, watched her with narrowed eyes. Then came the first test of her work, a real-time exercise built around a distress call from a remote science outpost near a notoriously unstable border zone. Her protocols kicked in, layered responses, diplomatic channels opened as a deterrent, and strike teams held in reserve, not as the first solution, but the absolute last. The results were unsettlingly effective. Hesitation echoed through the command channels, progress was slow, measured. Casualties on the simulated outpost were higher than statistically comfortable, but far lower than the freewheeling heroism of the old days would have wrought. Praise was muted, laced with criticism. Unnecessarily cautious, a missed opportunity. This isn't how wars are won in the real galaxy. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps Liara's countermeasures had tipped the balance too far, replacing recklessness with a paralysis of overanalysis. It was one conflict averted, but had she sown the seeds for a far greater defeat down the line? And then, like a cruel echo of her fears, news broke of an actual skirmish on the rim. Not a full-blown battle, but the kind of incident that could ignite something far worse. The human fleet contingent launched without hesitation, a textbook Ray's-style response. The aftermath hung heavy as Liara scrolled through the reports. Minimal loss of life, enemy forces scattered, and a chorus of whispers fueling old fears and rivalries. The League buzzed with unease, the League that her protocols had inadvertently made less decisive in a crisis. The official pronouncements hailed the skirmish as a decisive human victory, the ideal execution of the boldness that had become their trademark. Yet, beneath the triumphant buzz of the newsfeeds, Liara sensed something brittle, a shift in the currents of power she couldn't fully grasp. In the sim rooms, a new kind of defiance crackled in the air. Cadets, chafing under the restrictions Liara had woven into every scenario, started to treat her protocols as mere obstacles to overcome, finding loopholes with a ruthless glee that chilled her. Jensen, once humbled, was now her most vocal opponent, his every calculated risk during drills a pointed act of rebellion. The high-ranking official who'd empowered her paid a visit. His iridescent scales had lost their shifting luminescence, now a dull, skeptical gray. "Your protocols," he began, his voice strained, "they might have unintended consequences. We can't have our forces hesitate when true heroism is needed." Liara's mind raced. Were they looking for a scapegoat, someone to blame for a future failure born of her well-intentioned overcompensation? Or was this simply the inevitable swing of the pendulum, a galaxy craving decisive action after being forced to swallow too much caution? Desperate to salvage the situation, she spoke of balance, of integrating audacity with restraint. But her words sounded hollow in the face of the news pouring in. Traditional League powers clamoring for their own heroic response units, border outposts doubling their patrols, diplomatic channels choked with thinly veiled threats. The Rim conflict had ignited not outright war, but a tinderbox of aggression. Just as she'd feared, her attempt to curb recklessness had fueled a different kind of instability. Summoned to an impromptu strategy meeting, Liara found herself in familiar territory, the sleek command center of a flagship. But this time there was no raise to offer chilling wisdom, no cowl to temper boldness with diplomacy. Instead, a panel of unfamiliar faces, human and alien, regarded her with steely determination. "Instructor," the Admiral began, "you understand the unique nature of our forces. We need your expertise to ensure they're ready not just for restraint, but for the kind of audacious action that has won the day." It wasn't an accusation, but it was an ultimatum. The command center was a stark contrast to the classrooms Liara was accustomed to. Cold, efficient, designed to breed not doubt, but decisive action. To push back now would mark her as an enemy of the very human-influenced tactics, keeping a fragile peace. To agree would make her complicit in what might well become a reckless, destructive war. Sleepless nights were spent replaying potential arguments, searching for an angle the military minds wouldn't immediately dismiss. But with every scenario, she found herself backed into the same corner. Audacity, wielded without wisdom, was a weapon without a sheath, bound to cut all who came near. Yet, to her surprise, the summons that followed wasn't a tribunal. Instead, she was ushered into a dimly lit briefing room. There, Captain Chen herself awaited, the haunted look Liara remembered from history vids now a permanent fixture in her eyes. "They want more of the madness," Chen stated bluntly, foregoing the usual formalities. "More of me." There was a bitter edge to her self-reference. Reyes isn't here to temper them this time. Liara felt a surge of bitter vindication. Her quiet warnings had echoed all the way to the top. But vindication was a cold comfort in the face of looming catastrophe. "I cannot train them for madness, Captain," she said, surprised at her own firmness. "But I can teach them to understand it. To be a scalpel, not a wildfire." Chen considered her then, to Liara's astonishment, nodded slowly. "We shaped the galaxy, instructor. But we didn't think far enough ahead about the echoes of our victories." A flicker of dark humor touched her lips. "Maybe it's time to teach them to fear what they've become." The plan Liara and Chen forged was as dangerous as any battlefield maneuver. They couldn't dismantle the legend of Reyes or Chen herself; those myths were too ingrained in the military psyche. Instead, they would turn that legend into a cautionary tale. Sims were redesigned to focus on the aftermath of reckless gambles, not just the initial glory. Debriefings highlighted the sacrifices made, the scars left unseen on holovids of triumphant commanders, and in a twist so audacious it bordered on insane, Chen herself started lecturing, her words stripped of bravado, laying bare the haunting toll her victories had taken. It was walking a tightrope. One wrong word, and they'd be branded as traitors, trying to cripple their forces in the face of a rising threat. But there was a subtle shift in the cadets, a new kind of tension in the mess hall arguments. Jensen still swaggered, but doubt now edged his recklessness. The galaxy, though, seemed oblivious to their behind-the-scenes maneuvering. The rim remained a powder keg, the League thrummed with militaristic fervor. Liara watched the news feeds with mounting dread, half expecting the order that would shatter her fragile countermeasures. The order came disguised as a routine mission, a peacekeeping deployment to a contested system known for its volatile mix of League and fringe factions. Simple on paper, but Liara recognized it for what it was: a spark dropped near a powder keg. Her countermeasures, the doubt she'd painstakingly sown, seemed like a shield made of tissue paper against the tidal wave of inevitability. The cadets, now armed with a chilling awareness of consequences, were nonetheless caught in the intoxicating surge of a real deployment, their fear tempered by an eagerness forged in 1,000 simulations. Even Jensen's usual swagger was muted, replaced by a grim determination. News of the mission spread like wildfire. Hawkish factions across the League hailed it as proof that the era of hesitation was over. Whispers turned into panicked rumors, border skirmishes intentionally escalated, provocations disguised as accidents. Liara's worst nightmares were playing out in real time. Requests for simulations reflecting this volatile reality were met with grim approval from her superiors. The war room, once a place of sterile calculations, now throbbed with a chilling anticipation that made her skin crawl. Her scenarios, designed to highlight the cost of conflict, were co-opted, twisted into justifications for brutal first strikes and preemptive maneuvers. Chen, a constant presence aboard the flagship, was a ghost of her former self. her influence seemingly eclipsed by a new breed of commanders hungry to carve their own legends out of the coming war. Attempts to interject to remind them of the lessons so carefully crafted were met with condescending smiles and chilling reminders of Liara's own inexperience in true combat. The day the fighting started, Liara wasn't in the war room, but alone in her quarters. News feeds choked out fragmented reports, explosions, surprise attacks, then the sickening, inevitable announcement of full-scale combat echoing across the galaxy. This was beyond her control now, the consequences of her actions spiraling outward with unstoppable momentum. The first casualty reports scrolled across her screen. Names she recognized, cadets who grappled with complex simulations, now mere statistics. It was a wave of nausea, a guilt so profound it threatened to drown her. Had she inadvertently perfected a machine of war, fueled by an awareness of its own horrors, yet unable to resist its terrible momentum? Despair was a cold, relentless tide. Liara found herself drifting, going through the motions of her duties while her mind fixated on those flickering casualty reports. It wasn't just sorrow she felt, but bone-deep shame. She, with her meticulous plans and well-intentioned manipulations, had become an architect of this war, no less culpable than the admirals intoxicated by the promise of glory. Sleep became an impossible luxury. Dreams were haunted by the faces of those lost, their eyes reflecting not heroic determination, but the dawning horror of Liara's simulations made agonizingly real. Jensen's name wasn't among the lists. Yet, it was only a matter of time, a chilling testament to the effectiveness of her twisted curriculum. The news reports shifted. The first wave of victories gave way to messy stalemates, to mounting losses on both sides, turning public opinion from fervor to a simmering unease. The calls for bolder action, for the decisive, Reyes-style gambles that humans were now infamous for, grew louder, laced with a bitter undercurrent of blame. It was then, in a moment of desperate clarity born from rock-bottom resignation, that Liara saw her opening. They wanted madness? She understood its shape and its cost better than anyone else now. Every lesson, every agonizing simulation had etched into her the terrible patterns of how conflict unfolded. She requested an audience with the Admiral. They expected a broken idealist, ready to confess the failure of her reforms. Instead, with chilling calmness, Liara proposed not restraint, but a strategy of terrifying audacity. "They want the madness," she said, meeting the Admiral's skeptical gaze. "Let's give it to them. But this time, we'll turn it against them." Her plan, unveiled with unsettling familiarity in the very war room she had sought to transform, was breathtaking in its scope. False communications to fuel enemy paranoia, feints designed to lure them into overextending themselves, sacrifices calculated not for heroic purposes, but to shatter their morale. It was brutal, mirroring the very tactics that had sickened her. Yet, within the madness, there was a chilling logic, leveraging her unique understanding of how reckless gambles could backfire. The Admiral, after an initial stunned silence, smiled a predator's smile. In his eyes, Liara saw the intoxicating lure of an audacious gamble, the thrill of turning their own legend against them. Yet she also saw the desperate flicker of hope, the hope that this terrifying gambit might not just win battles, but break the cycle, ending the war far sooner than a traditional campaign ever could. Was she merely delaying the inevitable? Had the galaxy become so addicted to conflict that they'd find another excuse? Or could Liara, the reluctant architect of war, use their thirst for madness to forge a brutal, unsatisfying peace? The war took on a strange, unsettling rhythm. News broadcasts touted bold offensives met with even bolder counterstrikes. Publicly, the human-led forces embraced their role of audacious heroes. Internally, however, Liara's machinations had their insidious effect. The enemy, expecting reckless abandon, found themselves facing meticulously crafted traps. Their commanders, driven by ambition and a fear of appearing hesitant, lunged for what seemed like easy victories only to be cut off, flanked, and left in disarray. Confusion rippled through their ranks, paranoia fueled by Liara's carefully planted false intel. It wasn't the clean, glorious war they'd envisioned. In the war room, a grim satisfaction settled over Liara. Her predictions proved chillingly accurate. Yet there was no joy in it. Every feint that cost lives, human and alien, chipped away at her soul. Chen watched her with a haunted understanding, a silent acknowledgement that they both had become what they once feared. Jensen, now a combat veteran returned from the front lines, carried none of his old swagger. He sought Liara out, his eyes reflecting not the thrill of battle simulations, but the bleak reality. "This isn't." He struggled for words, then settled on, "This isn't what they taught us about heroism." Liara had no comforting lies to offer. "What they taught was the cost," she said quietly. "We both know how to amplify that cost to make it unbearable." It wasn't an apology, but an acknowledgement of their complicity. The turning point was as brutal as it was unsatisfying. Lured by the promise of a crippling strike against a key supply depot, the enemy fleet was ambushed with a savagery designed to break their spirit as much as their forces. The news sparked not jubilation, but a wave of revulsion across the League, a stark reminder that the legends were built on corpses, not triumphs. In the ensuing chaos, Liara pushed even harder. Whispered negotiations were initiated, not to sue for peace, but to exploit enemy divisions and stoke further distrust. It was ugly, fueled by desperation, not idealism. But it worked. The war machine, deprived of easy glory, began to sputter. The ceasefire, when it came, wasn't signed with triumphant fanfare. It was a messy thing, born of exhaustion and mutual distrust. Neither side claimed true victory, merely the right to lick their wounds and resent the next inevitable round. Liara was hailed as a strategic genius, her name whispered in the corridors of power. Yet in her quarters, amidst the echoes of celebrations she couldn't stomach, she felt hollowed out. The war had been won, or at least paused, by becoming the very thing she stood against. It was a victory that tasted like ashes. Peace, when it came, felt more like a collective hangover than a cause for celebration. Exhausted populations across the League looked not for heroes, but for answers no one could truly provide. Liara's name, elevated then tainted by her ruthless war strategies, faded into a figure of whispered controversy. Was she a savior or the architect of a new, even more insidious kind of conflict? The Academy became a microcosm of the galaxy's uneasy state. Cadets returned not with swagger, but haunted eyes that sought out Liara with an unnerving mix of fear and desperate hope. Jensen, his ambition shattered, became an unlikely ally, his chilling battlefield experiences a blunt counterpoint to the hunger for glory still echoing in the training halls. Chen was nowhere to be found. Rumors abounded retirement, a classified mission so dangerous it demanded her unique skill, even suicide driven by the weight of choices made. Her absence was a constant reminder of the price paid for Liara's temporary, horrifyingly effective solution. Kalo, now a revered stateswoman whose vision had been warped by this brutal war, sought Liara out. There was no accusation in her eyes, only a weary sorrow. "We pushed the galaxy forward," she murmured, "but perhaps too far. Audacity is a potent weapon, but as you learned, it cuts both ways." It was in the faces of her cadets that Liara saw her greatest challenge. They still craved heroes, the simplicity of a galaxy where boldness could solve all problems. How could she teach them about balance, about the terrible, necessary wisdom of restraint, when her own actions had painted her as the master of madness? The next skirmish, sparked by a reckless pirate raid on a League outpost, came far sooner than anyone wished. Calls for a swift, decisive retaliation echoed across the League. The news feeds, subdued but no less potent for it, buzzed with renewed anticipation. The cycle was poised to begin anew. This time, when the summons from the war room came, it felt not like a solution, but the start of a long, grueling punishment. Liara took her place among strategists and admirals. Yet she was no longer a silent observer, nor a manipulative force from within. There, with the fate of countless lives tilting on her words, Liara made a final, audacious gamble. She would speak not as a strategist, but a survivor. She would lay bare the cost of madness, not in simulations, but in scars both seen and unseen. The galaxy, craving its heroes and easy answers, would not be easily swayed. But in that war room, amidst those hungry for the thrill of calculated gambles, Liara sowed the seed of a different legend. Not of glorious victories, but of the terrible, unbearable weight of war, and the desperate hope that perhaps one day the galaxy would find the courage to choose a wiser, if far less exciting, path.